Good morning, everyone. I'm Douglas Isles. I'm chair of the Summit Organising Committee, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first plenary of Day 2. We're applying the Summit theme to edge cases in investment management, and I'm delighted to be joined by Susie Riddell, the CEO of Social Ventures Australia, and Sam Kilmere, the head of Dynamic Asset Allocation at the Future Fund. This morning, we will think bigger and live better. Yesterday, in our opening keynote, Anne Sherry talked about ESG being critical across all of corporate Australia, but that most of the emphasis is currently on the E. Today, Susie's focus will be squarely on the S, and I would argue that Sam's focus will be squarely on the G. Everyone in this room is an investor in their own right. You're all forced savers. But many of you will work closely with investment teams in your work, and some of you are directly involved. Whatever your current involvement, I hope that Susie and Sam will open your minds to two big ideas and more. Susie will demonstrate that we can invest for good, and Sam will firstly share with us the benefits of scale. I'd like you to welcome Sam and Susie.
Thank you very much for having me, Douglas, and to the Actuaries Institute. I am an actuary, but I don't practice as one anymore, but it's great to be here and hopefully share something of use to you on what it is to be a big investor. And as Douglas said, the G, how we can take some of the concepts that we use at Future Fund and apply them in different investment settings. So I'm going to cover a few things here. What is Future Fund? I'm going to talk about thinking big and whole of portfolio. That's really the hallmark of how the Future Fund invests. This idea of the best portfolio. So that's a concept that we think about every day, and it's, we think, differentiated from how a lot of other investors think, and then wrap it up. So what is Future Fund? We are Australia's sovereign wealth fund. We have 7 funds that we manage for the Commonwealth, the largest of which is the Future Fund itself. And that has the most ambitious return target. It's a real return of 4 to 5. We also have the Medical Research Future Fund, which is approaching 10 years old now. It's a fund that makes grants or gives money that is then made into grants for medical research initiatives. Our board also decides how much can be distributed for that. And then we have a range of other funds that have specific purposes which make distributions every year, and those are CPI plus 2 to 3 funds, and finally the Disability Care Australia Fund, which is a much lower risk mandate. It's really about just holding onto that capital for disability care in the future. Oops, gone the wrong way there. So overall, we're managing about $285 billion, which is reasonably big. And you can see here, don't worry too much about the detail of this slide, but this is essentially giving you a sense of the liabilities that the Future Fund is trying to offset. So on the left-hand side, you can see the Commonwealth's unfunded super liability. That's why the Future Fund was created. It's really all of the public servants, even the judges, the Governor-General, all of those guys in together, guys and girls in together to pay their super benefits into the future, because we have a pay-as-you-go system at the Commonwealth level, and the Future Fund is there to help smooth the cost of that over time. And it is a substantial offset to gross debt, you can see on the right-hand side, but we expect to be paying out eventually, to start to pay off those unfunded liabilities, and that means the Future Fund will gradually diminish. Initially, the plan was to pay off from 2020. That got deferred because the liabilities had grown. The government wanted to keep building the Future Fund up and not pay down too soon and run out of money. So that's been deferred. The latest intergenerational report is looking at around 2031, 32 to start making those distributions, but still a decision for government to be made. Here's a bit of a sense of our journey since we were incepted in the future fund and the returns that we've achieved. So the target return there is CPI plus 4 or 4.5. That changed a little bit in its history, but that's what the target return represents. And we've generally done a pretty good job of delivering on that over the long term. On the bottom right, hopefully you can see it there, really just trying to give a sense of what our asset allocation looks like. And what you can see is that there are substantial allocations to a lot of different asset classes. And it probably looks somewhat different from perhaps what you're used to seeing from many other investors, such as super funds in Australia or global funds. We have substantial exposures to private equity, property, infrastructure, timber, credit portfolio. We have an alternatives portfolio, which is quite sizable, which is really about generating cash plus returns with very low correlation to broad markets. And our overall risk exposure, I would summarise as being equivalent to an equity beta of about 61% at the moment. We call that equivalent equity exposure, and it's just a way of summarising risk exposure. That's a bit lower than some of our global peers. So we're tending to rely more on what we call alpha, so any returns in excess of broad markets, or beta. We're relying on that a bit more than our global peers are in trying to deliver a real return of 4. And that goes a little bit to our view of the world, which I'll come to. So thinking big in this context, I think, is about thinking whole of portfolio and about thinking what you can do with your whole portfolio, not just different sections of your portfolio, sectors. Most investors around the world still use an approach where there's a top-down decision about how to allocate capital. That capital is given to different asset class teams, and those asset class teams then try to go out and fill the capital buckets that they're given, try to beat the benchmarks that their board or their investment committee gives to them. We are trying to do something a bit different, which is think holistically about the portfolio at all times and build the best portfolio we can for our mandate at all times. Now, I couldn't get through an actuarial presentation without some kind of control cycle, and if my lecturer from actual control cycle, Jules Gribble, is somewhere here, he hopefully is slightly proud that we've come up with our own control cycle at Future Fund, and it's got 3 cycles within it. So there's the slower moving foundation cycle, which is really about the very basics of how we interpret our mandate. What do we believe about the world? What is our secular outlook for the world? That shapes everything we do. Then the next cycle is the strategy cycle, which is what are we going to do with those beliefs and that view of the world? How are we going to set our risk level? What are we going to do around currency and liquidity risk? And what are our different teams within our investment team going to design as their long-term strategies? And then inside that cycle, the most fast-moving of them is the asset cycle, which is really find the best opportunities. So you've got a strategy, you've got broad objectives, you've got constraints. What are the best opportunities that everyone in our investment team can find wherever they are? So it might be in the credit team, it might be in the property team, it might be a particular part of property, it might be a particular region, a particular part of property. And then thinking about what can you do with that at the total fund level, rather than I'm a property investor, I'm going to build a diversified property portfolio. Think, I'm a property investor, what are the very best property opportunities I can see which contribute the most to the total portfolio? So it's quite a different philosophy, I think. So just talking through these cycles a little bit more, foundation cycle is really about knowing thyself. So understand what are your risk tolerances, and very importantly, do that in advance because the big trap that boards and committees fall into is that if they haven't properly defined their risk appetite in different dimensions, market risk, liquidity risk, whatever, the market will take them there sooner, eventually the market will take them there, and they will find that a poorly defined risk tolerance is a recipe for investment failure. So what will tend to happen is you will cut your risk at the worst possible time. You will capitulate. You will change what you care about if you haven't written it down and agreed and got everyone's buy-in to it. So this is a really important one. The next is decide what you believe, and importantly, what you don't, and stick to those things unless something really changes. And the third is identify your edge or lack thereof, and I want to talk a little bit about that in the future fund context. Maybe that's useful for you in thinking about your context. So comparative advantages, there's really 5 that we identify around a culture of one team, one purpose. So I'm on the left-hand side here. And these are the ones we think make us slightly better off than some other investors, give us a bit of an edge. Total portfolio approach, we think, is one of them, because we don't think that's very common. Long investment horizon, that's actually quite rare. There is a lot of market action that is driven by short-term objectives. Access to high-caliber partners and reputation, I think, are related, but it is basically about being an investor of good standing, an investor that other investors want to work with, and accessing those relationships that give you access to the best alpha or the best opportunities. And you can see our managers on our website, and we have some of the very best managers across asset classes, and I think a lot of that is built on our reputation. And the last one is single client and purpose, which is, of course, the Commonwealth, and through them, the taxpayers of Australia. We are totally focused on them as our client and the objectives of the funds as our purpose. We don't have any other commercial imperatives, or we don't have to trade off a range of different clients in very different circumstances. So that's another advantage. Disadvantages are also important. So being big is not necessarily the best. It has advantages. Scale is very useful for getting you in the room. But if you're very big, and I would say we're pretty big, you actually start to suffer from diseconomies of scale. So some of the very best ideas that we find, we don't do as much of them as we would like to. And we have to work out how we're going to fairly give those opportunities to the different funds that we manage. So it's not all about, bigger is better. I think mid-sized investors sometimes underappreciate the advantage that they have in being able to scale up their best ideas. We can't borrow, and we have to be careful about our impact on the Australian financial markets. That's in our legislation. And we do have a pro-cyclical base currency, which is something that many people in this room would have if you're investing Australian dollars into foreign markets. You have a currency that tends to be positively related with risk, and that creates its own challenges, particularly around hedging and liquidity risk from hedging. This is a busy slide, so I won't go into detail, but I want to give you a sense of how we think about our secular outlook. We do think that around about the time of the pandemic, there was an acceleration in the way the world was changing. And we think about this in a number of orders, starting with the world order at the bottom, which is really, how is geopolitics arranged? How are the major powers interacting? How is global trade working, etc.? The macroeconomic order in terms of the impact of all of that on growth, inflation, interest rates, currencies. The policy order, which is how are different policymakers, fiscal, monetary, regulators behaving, and how is the politics changing the way they're behaving? And then the market order. Ultimately, the tip of the iceberg is how does all of that affect the outcomes that we see in the market every day and the behaviour of different markets? And we've got a couple of position papers out there which suggest that this world is different now from the last 10 to 20 years. It's going to be one, we think, with greater geopolitical risks and potentially more hot conflict and not hot conflict, higher, more volatile inflation. There's going to be more intervention in general, we think, by policymakers, more populist type policies on average. And it's going to lead to more price volatility and fragility. It's going to lead to correlations between asset classes being perhaps surprising. That's a really important backdrop for us. So then we come to building our portfolio, and I won't spend too much on this, but essentially it's big trade-offs. So we want to try and achieve our real return, but then we have to think about how much market risk are we prepared to take to do that. As I said before, there's the currency decision and the liquidity risk impact of that. We want to be able to survive liquidity risk events as well as thrive, ideally, from them. So we think about both a crash test, where we crash markets and see can our portfolio survive, but then we also have a flexibility test. And I think this is something any investor can do. You can draw this up for yourself in your own context. So for Future Fund here, we're striving for CPI plus 5, the top end of our mandate. We're looking at equivalent equity exposure of about 60, as I said before. We have a range for that. We're prepared to move that around, and I can talk about that later if there's any questions, but medium-term DAA is part of my team that focuses on how to move the portfolio around cyclically. And then this liquidity risk component, very important for Australian investors, for investors with cash flows, for investors that may have unreliable cash flows in, etc. So it's all about these trade-offs and finding the sweet spot for your particular circumstances. So I actually didn't realize this was going to build up like this, but here you go. So this is the strategy cycle, and the foundation view, really the view of the world, sits at the bottom. On the right-hand side, you have this pyramid of broad beta exposures. So think about beta on the right and alpha on the left. And then we're building up beta from how much structural risk do we want? I talked about EEE of 60, structural risk. Long-term strategy, what's our view of the world and how do we want to position the major exposures like bond exposure, currency exposure, commodity exposure for that environment? And then medium-term strategy, how do we want to vary that depending upon the outlook? And one thing that's a bit different about Future Fund is our long-term strategy is very much dynamic. So a lot of funds will set a reference portfolio or a long-term strategic asset allocation, and that will tend to be fairly unchanged and fairly sticky, hard to change. You have to have a really good reason to change it. We review our long-term strategy continuously, and we do make changes to it relatively frequently, depending upon how we think the world is shifting and whether or not that is priced into markets. And on the left, it's all the extra activity that our asset teams are doing to find the best opportunities. So that, we think, is our best portfolio. And I think these principles you can apply in almost any investment context. It's just some of them maybe you don't do because you're doing something perhaps with fewer asset classes or a different kind of mandate, but essentially these principles, I think, apply across the board. So I've just talked about this, and I think this is important. I love this quote from John Maynard Keynes. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And I think it's common for people to assume that a change of mind is a mistake, that you got something wrong, and that it's something to be avoided. And I think in investing, we actually think that this is a healthy thing to do. And this is what guides us in our long-term strategy being dynamic rather than static. So a quick application of this, I talked about the environment we see on the left and some of those features. A really natural area that this affects our strategy is through correlation expectations. So building a diversified portfolio requires some assessment of and belief in correlations. And we think these correlations, I've called them here equity betas, essentially that's the magnitude adjusted version of correlation. We think they're regime dependent. So if we look at commodities, that's been very pro-cyclical. It's had a lot of equity beta in it the last 10, 20 years. We actually think it might be shifting to be less pro-cyclical. And that's because commodities are becoming a more important factor in geopolitics, in the world order, and scarcity of commodities and energy in particular, and the ability for commodity price spikes or energy shocks to have a negative impact on the global economy is coming into sharper focus now. So commodities could play a more diversifying role. And the other one that's clear to us is nominal interest rates. So if you've got a world where there's more fiscal, there's more populism, interest rates are likely to be higher. They are also likely to be more volatile. There's likely to be more intervention. The correlation that you relied upon historically to diversify equities may not be there. It could be that an inflation shock or fiscal getting out of control, too much borrowing, could actually be a major risk event for all asset classes. And therefore, let's be careful about assuming that bonds are diversifying. So that's two big ways that it plays in. I won't talk too much more about the asset cycle because I'm running out of my allocated time. We want to get on to make sure that Susie gets her time and we have some questions. But look, the cost of capital is also an important concept. This is where we look at individual investments. And so I have an example here of two investments that we might look at. A macro hedge fund platform with a nominal return but high volatility, a US renewables project with a higher return, but it's denominated in US dollars, it's highly illiquid, and so on. It's got leverage, it's got possible regulatory risk. So on the face of it, you might say, well, just buy the renewables project, right? This is great. It's got great ESG characteristics and it's got a high return. But we always like to look at what does it bring to our portfolio. So we build up a cost of capital that's based on our circumstances. So real rates, inflation, what is the equity-like risk embedded in that? Is it a development project? Is it an existing asset? What are the risks around the agreements with the buyer of the power, with local authorities, etc.? What is the currency risk that we have? Is it a liquid? If it's a liquid, we can't use it to fund its own currency hedge. We have to create that liquidity from somewhere else. So we build up the cost of capital. Then we look at the difference between the two, the expected return and the cost of capital, and that's what we would call kind of the true alpha. And in this case, they're actually quite similar. Like in this example, the illustration here is to say it's not all about headline return. It depends upon the benefits and costs that the asset brings to your total portfolio. The thing about doing bottom-up investing and aggregating lots of opportunities is you might end up with a portfolio that has some biases in it, has some unintended bets in it that you didn't actually want to make. And so an important rounding out of being a total fund investor is this idea of lenses. So we will look at, through different dimensions, what are all of our assets bringing to our total fund, whether it's geography, industry, or other factor exposures. We'll say, does that mean we have an implied view? So we'll baseline that. What's a typical view? What's a common view among peers, for example? And then we'll say, all right, it looks like we have an implied view here that Japan equities are really bad value because none of our managers have gone out and bought Japan equities. This is a live example, but we actually did this. And we realized we don't have that view. We actually have a view that Japan is looking much better, that corporate governance is improving, that returns in Japan might be better. So we offset that view at the fund level with a completion trade. So it's very important, I think, to have that whole of fund view at the end to make sure you're not doing something you never intended to do. So that's really it for me. It's all about whole portfolio. It's about knowing yourself and being tailored to that, building a strategy to your objectives. Be prepared to change your view and your strategy and find the best opportunities you can, but make sure that in the end you're rounding it out by looking for any biases and correcting those. I'll finish there. Pass over to Susie.
Thanks, well done.
Wow, thanks, Sam. That was fantastic. Good morning. Hi, everyone. I'm Susie. Aren't we on a spectacular part of Ugamba country here on the Gold Coast? I went for a run next to the beach. Great day, sunny, excited people here to learn. It's a pleasure to be here. Today, what I'm going to do is introduce to you my organisation, Social Ventures Australia, and take you through two examples of the social impact investing that we have been leading over around the last decade in Australia. So SVA is one of Australia's most innovative social impact organisations. We're a not-for-profit organisation, And we have a vision of an Australia where all people and communities can thrive. We're here to lead the charge on addressing issues that at times can seem too hard. And we want to speed up the development of innovative approaches that actually use evidence to change policy, to influence funding flows, to influence practice so that we do much more of what works and create better outcomes for people and communities. Right now, that's not what it looks like in Australia. 1 in 4 people in Australia experience disadvantage in the form of poverty, social exclusion, and deprivation, or sometimes all of those, and sometimes for their whole lives, or even passed down through generations. And we're trying to shift that. We're trying to shift that for First Nations people and communities. We're trying to shift it for the 1 in 6 children in Australia who are growing up in a household experiencing poverty. For the 1 in 4 young people who, by the time they get to the age of 15, are 3 years behind in literacy and numeracy their more advantaged peers. And for the 1 in 5 young people who are out of work or can't get enough hours doing work that has a meaningful career progression. And we just think that's unacceptable. Australia is a country with a lot going for it, and we think working together with governments, with businesses, with not-for-profits and with philanthropy, we can do a lot better than that. The way we work is we start with the problem. What is the problem that we're trying to address? And then what are the different kinds of tools that we might be able to bring to bear to try to address those? So that includes incubating new types of ventures or new types of approaches that haven't been done in Australia or haven't been done in a particular domain or area. We provide consulting services where we're working with not-for-profit organisations, with governments, with businesses, with philanthropists on their strategy, how can they think about how they could have more social impact, and also on monitoring, evaluation and learning. Is what you're doing actually achieving the social impact that you intended to achieve? I'll tell you today about a couple of the examples where we're trying to unlock new sources of capital and the role that returnable capital can play in some of these solutions. And then we take the insights from each of those different modes and advocate to governments around the country to influence their policy and influence how they're investing or spending their money to try to get better outcomes. So this has seen us partner with a lot of different kinds of organisations. We partner with governments, we partner with commercial organisations, with investors. Hopefully a few of you can see your own organisation up there, and we like working with very different kinds of organisations. It requires us to be quite multilingual, if you like, because they have quite different cadences, they have different objectives, they have different ways of working. When we look at some of the problems that we're interested in Australia, it's clear that returnable capital can play a key role. So social impact investing is investing with the explicit intention of generating a financial return for your investors, as well as a measurable social impact, the S in ESG. At SVA, we believe you need to really clearly articulate what the social outcomes are that you are trying to achieve and, crucially, measure them. So we're not talking just glossy photos midway through the annual review that describes the sort of extra social things that you can tell stories about. This is about a very data-driven and evidence-driven approach to understanding social impact. We've been a pioneer in social impact investing in Australia, and a couple of the things that we've done over the last decade. Just over a decade ago, we pioneered the landmark deal to acquire the collapsed ABC Learning, Early Childhood Education and Care operation, and together with a syndicate of other not-for-profits, we converted that into a not-for-profit itself called Good Start. Good Start is the largest not-for-profit early childhood education and care provider in Australia. It has 700 centres across the country, turns over $1 billion, and supports 50,000 children and families across the country every year. Has dramatically improved quality in its centres over that decade, and really importantly, has influenced a lot of government policy on how can we drive up quality and inclusion for early learning across the country. We led the introduction of social impact bonds into Australia, and I'll give you an example of what that looks like shortly after this. We also led the movement on social impact funds, where the objective of the fund is to generate a social impact as well as a financial return. Now, these were very much demonstration scale. So our first social impact fund was a $9 million fund. We followed on with our diversified impact fund, which was $15 million, and then had the first mandate from a super fund in Australia managing a fund on behalf of HESTA. And that reached $91 million and successfully demonstrated the role that institutions can play in investing for social impact as well as a financial return. Now, what are we investing in? We're investing in things like demonstration projects in affordable housing, education technology companies, disability enterprises. We're investing in accommodation that's an innovative approach for aged care, First Nations enterprises. So both debt and equity, very diversified, also very small. We count in the millions, not the billions, Sam. We have more recently established a joint venture, which is a fund investing in specialist disability accommodation, part of the NDIS approach, and I'll tell you about that one as well. So I'm going to tell you about one of our social impact bonds and then our specialist disability accommodation fund. The Newpin Social Benefit Bond was the first social impact bond in Australia. And a social impact bond has payments that are linked to very clearly agreed upon outcomes that can be measured that relate to the social impact of the work. So in order to have a social impact bond, you need a very clearly defined population, and you also need very high quality data. So a lot of the problems that I mentioned up top have very poor quality data and not very clearly defined populations. So these only apply in quite specific circumstances. The problem in this case that we were trying to address is the growing number of children who are in Australia's out-of-home care systems. So children are taken and put into the out-of-home care system for their own safety. Unfortunately, it's very expensive for the state, and this is a state and territory responsibility, and in general, being in the out-of-home care system leads to poorer education attainment, poorer mental health and wellbeing, lower workforce participation later in life, and higher rates of interaction with the justice system. So it's expensive, it's poor outcomes for young people, and it's not a desirable outcome for most parents either. So one way to address this is to build the capability and the capacity of parents so that children can be safely reunited with their parents. In New South Wales, there was a very high-quality, promising program that was quite innovative called Newpin. What Newpin did is deliver a program for parents. Parents attended the program 2 days a week for up to 18 months. They received a lot of support on how to address emotional issues, improve bonding with their child or their children, and develop positive parenting skills. Often they came from circumstances where they hadn't had those positive parenting skills role modelled to them and didn't have lots of things in place that supported them to have a great home environment, like secure, safe, appropriate housing. The New South Wales government was interested to test this. If we invest in this kind of program, what type of outcomes do we get? And crucially, how does that compare to what we're getting at the moment? So SVA worked very closely with the New South Wales government and with the service provider Uniting to develop a very detailed model for this first social impact bond. My former colleague Elise Sainty, who developed this, is an actuary, and it absolutely takes that sort of skill set because it's very detailed modelling, a deep understanding of data, of evaluation methodologies, costs and benefits, payment schemes, and the ability to communicate all of those to both government, so sort of central treasury as well as line agencies, and to not-for-profit service delivery organisations and to investors. So the financial instrument is an innovative social financing mechanism. The purpose is to run an experiment. It's to help test whether this approach gets better outcomes than you would otherwise see. They're a form of outcomes contracting, and that means we're bringing together investors who invest into a trust, a service provider who's providing the service directly to people in the community, and governments who stand to save money if this works. The investors provide upfront capital, essentially the working capital for the service provider to be able to provide the service. And if those programs achieve predefined outcomes, governments will then pay and that is used to provide investors with a linked financial return. So everything is agreed in advance in terms of what those outcomes may look like and what the returns to investors may be if they're achieved. So investors need to be able to diligence the risk in this, and when you were talking about risk, Sam, this is a difficult area for a lot of investors to understand what is the underlying set of risks in a very niche program for a very specific cohort. One of the roles that SVA can play is deeply understanding what the evidence is of these programs, what the track record is so far, and being able to articulate what that risk looks like. So investors in this case invested $7 million for a period of 7 years. Family restoration, so where the kids were back together with their parents, were approved by the New South Wales Children's Court, so it was independent. Otherwise, you'd create some incentives for the program providers to simply keep putting kids back with families, even if it wasn't safe. And the investor returns were based on the proportion of children participating in the program who were restored to their families. The Newpin Social Impact Bond ran for its full 7 years and was a resounding success, both in terms of the test as well as the outcomes for families and for investors. So 391 children were safely restored to the care of their families, and this represented a restoration rate of 61%. It was close to 3 times the counterfactual. 20% of the families referred into the program were First Nations families. It generated savings for government and a financial return of 10% per annum for those investors. So it was a proof of concept both of the program itself and also of a social impact bond as a mechanism to run experiments. Since then, Newpin has been rolled out into a number of other states and has an outcomes-based contract, not a bond, but just an outcomes-based contract in New South Wales. We've managed another 7 social impact bonds around the country, focusing on things like rough sleeping, youth employment, educational attainment, severe mental ill health, and soon to come, people exiting prison. My colleague Kirsten Armstrong, who now manages this work at SVA, is also an actuary, so thrilled to have your skills applied to this kind of work. But what does it mean for living better? In terms of living better, I wanted to share with you the story of Jennifer. So Jennifer had a 9-month-old son, Patrick, who was in out-of-home care. Imagine that. Imagine having a 9-month-old baby and they're not with you. In Jennifer's words, not having your children with you is very hard. She felt very unsure about her future before she started Newpin. And at the end of 18 months in the program, she described herself as an independent, confident single mum. Patrick's back with Jennifer. Jennifer has a supportive environment and has built new skills. And so we see that as a huge win for living better for Patrick and Jennifer, savings for the state, and now great evidence that we can use to roll out to many more families like Jennifer and Patrick. So that's a very small edge case of running experiments with social finance. Another experiment that we are excited is now at the point of scaling is around specialist disability accommodation. The problem we were trying to address here is the very small number of people who are participants in NDIS who are eligible for specialist disability accommodation. So either they need very heavily modified homes because of physical disability, or they need 24 live-in carer support. This represents about 28,000 people on the scheme, so it's a very small proportion. And out of that 28,000, about 12,000 people don't have access to appropriate housing at the moment. And probably 8,000 will need to be rehoused because their homes are inappropriate at the moment. So we need to build a lot more houses, an estimated $10 billion worth of new houses. Meanwhile, those people are living in really inadequate situations, often living at home with ageing parents who are terrified about what might happen to their children when they pass away, or in nursing homes and hospitals, which are not a place to call home. So we knew we needed new homes. The government was very motivated to do it quickly and to do it at scale. So what the Commonwealth Government implemented is a scheme that was designed to attract institutional investors to quickly build many new residential homes that meet the definition of specialist disability accommodation. In the beginning, institutions weren't really biting, and this is because they perceived that there was both pricing risk and horizon risk. So in terms of pricing, what if a new government's elected and they don't buy into this scheme and we're not going to earn returns in later years? And in terms of horizon, fears from those who invested in the national NRAS, what was it? National Rental Affordability housing. I should have worked out what that stood for before. NRAS was only 10 years, and most housing investments need to be around 30 years. So there was concern from institutions, are we going to be able to invest for the horizon that this requires? We were part of a coalition of a lot of different organisations who advocated for changes to the policy and the pricing mechanisms, and now we've seen changes that have attracted really serious institutional investment, both from Australian institutions and international institutions. We knew there was a lack of quality homes and that we would need to partner with people who knew what it took to build residential accommodation, but that there's a number of other players in that setup as well. So we created Synergis Fund as a joint venture with Federation Asset Management, who had specialisation in real estate and particularly had skills that they could apply in residential real estate. What the fund does is unlock new sources of institutional capital and then partner with specialist disability accommodation developers. So those developers build houses and then supported independent living providers, predominantly not-for-profit organisations who are attached to participants who provide the in-home care and support for those individuals. The partnering approach ensured that we could make investments that are high-quality properties in locations where people want to live that are going to be serviced by high-quality supported independent living providers. And what we are really excited about in this scheme is that the money goes with the tenant, it doesn't go with the property. So you can't build houses that no one wants to live in and still earn a return. You have to build things that people actually want to live in, and that provides the individual with a lot of choice and control. The Synergis Fund now has $600 million of capacity, that's both equity and debt. We have 130 investments that we've committed. That translates already into safe, appropriate and affordable homes for 509 people. We expect that our fund will get to around $1 billion and that, as I said before, this emerging asset class will be about $10 billion in the next 10 years. What's unique about this model is that it really puts the person with disability at the centre of the work. We were concerned that as institutions came in, they wouldn't necessarily have mechanisms in place to elevate the voice of people who are living in these homes. So, as I explained, the rental payments go to the tenants, and that provides a really good safeguard against poor quality housing. We, alongside a number of other organisations, created what's called the Disability Housing Outcomes Framework to monitor and measure the outcomes for tenants as well. And the idea behind that is that institutional investors and investors into other funds as well will be able to see quantitative information about their financial return and also quantitative information in a standardised way about the social impact that they're generating for their tenants and people who are living with a disability in these homes. So the Synergis Fund has also created an advisory committee which includes tenants, people with lived experience, social sector experts, housing design specialists, to make sure that we're really focused on the outcomes for people alongside generating financial returns. Each of these features were very much designed to be aligned with the idea of power, choice and control under NDIS. So back to the idea of living better. What does it mean for the actual people who live in these homes? This is Kevin, and he had a stroke. And even though he was told that he could be discharged from hospital, there was nowhere for him to go that was appropriate and safe and affordable for him to live. And so for 2 more years, he lived in hospital. Imagine that. You don't need to be there, but there's nowhere else to go. And so you're stuck in hospital. You have no choice over your food, over your schedule, over your decor, and over when people get to come and visit you. It's not really a place to call home. He was one of the 20,000 people with disability who were living in unsuitable accommodation. And I'm pleased to say Kevin is now living in one of the homes that the Synergis Fund built in Mount Colah in New South Wales. And for Kevin, having a home that met his needs meant he could say goodbye to hospital and regain his independence. In his words, the day he got to come home with his own stereo, his own food and his own decor was the day that he won. So these are just some of the ways that SVA has been pioneering new ways of investing and using returnable capital to demonstrate what works and to generate both a financial return and a social impact. In addition to the impact that these things have on individuals, we've been taking these lessons to take to institutions and to governments to show the power of high-quality data and measurement, evaluation and learning for driving better outcomes. Often, this is part of the thesis for why people invest in lots of different types of asset classes, but it's not measured, so they can't actually use it to compare the different types of investments that are on the table. Nirvana, sometime in the future, is much more rigorous monitoring, evaluation and learning, standardised data sets, and then a willingness to invest on that basis. And I think what's promising, and I'm happy to answer questions about this from a Commonwealth government and state and territory government perspective, is there is warm enthusiasm for outcomes frameworks, for wellbeing budgeting, and for outcomes funds. And we hope that that means that it'll be easier to assess these things and weigh them up and make those trade-offs in investing in the future. So if there's interest, happy to talk about these products and innovations as well as what might happen in the future in Australia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you, Sam. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please do type them into the app, and I can see some of them have come through already. Before I go to the questions from the group, I just think it's interesting. You guys are both at sort of opposite edges, if you like, of the investment industry. I just wondered if each of you had a takeaway from what the other was saying, and maybe something that you could think about in what you're doing. Maybe I'll give Susie a rest from standing up. Maybe Sam, if you want to go first there.
Great question. So we don't account for social impact in what we do, but I think we can always get better at thinking holistically about the benefits of the investments we make from the point of view that the more successful they are in delivering good outcomes, the more sustainable they probably are. And I think the days are gone where you should just look purely at the financial bottom line. We have a financial mandate, but I think we also have a responsibility to ensure that what we're doing is sustainable, and that itself is a form of risk management. So for me, it just really highlights the criticality of that.
Cool. Susie, did you learn anything from the Future Fund?
What I was fascinated about was the long-term investment horizon, because I think over the long term, things that drive impact in multiple different ways are going to deliver better financial returns. It's also the horizon where it's clearest that some of the social contracts that we have in this country are going to be weakened. So, for example, universal healthcare, aged care, pensions, as we age, as productivity growth slows, it's harder to be convinced in the long run that we've got what it takes to deliver the quality of life that we've basically promised for people in Australia.
Okay, thanks. I did want to ask one more question before I go to here, and it was, obviously we have a room full of actuaries. Susie, you touched on a couple of things actuaries were doing in your area, including what you're saying about Kirsten, but I'm just curious, you think sort of to inspire the people in the room, maybe some of the ways in which you think they might think about having a bigger impact?
I'm not an actuary. It's a pleasure to be hosted by all the actuaries. Look, I think your deep understanding around data and evaluation and things like cost-benefit could be applied in many more areas, and health seems to be much further ahead than some other social domains, like education and housing and disability and others. So that's an area that I think is rich for the tapping. And the other area is around understanding counterfactuals and how they can apply outside of medicine. So there's a lot of reluctance in many areas that we work in to run experiments. They're seen as unethical, and I think there's many different ways to conceptualise that and articulate what's possible that we probably could answer without even having to run new experiments.
Yeah, excellent, thanks. And Sam, you are an actuary, so I mean, you showed us the cycle, but how do you feel you're using your actuarial training and disciplines in the work you're doing?
Every day. I mean, the skills you learn in the actuarial education just are applicable in so many areas that involve any kind of enumeration, risk. So I work with quite a few people who have at one point in time been actuaries or in the education, and I would use the principles that Richard Fitzherbert taught me in financial maths or David Dixon taught me in risk. Yep. I would use them every day in some form or another. So very valuable to have skills where you can think about things probabilistically. Yep. It's actually not something a lot of people can do.
Excellent. All right, thank you. Okay, so going to the questions that are coming in. A question for you, Sam. Oh. You mentioned that the future fund investment strategy is very different to what others are doing from that sort of top-down perspective. What have you done to give your stakeholder the comfort that this is actually the right path to go down?
That's a good question. So always important to have your stakeholder, your primary stakeholder, in this case, that's our board, which is appointed by the minister and oversees the agency that manages the funds, have them really understanding and actually forming the basis of what we do. So they basically workshop and agree what our beliefs are going to be. They help us set the risk appetite. They help us set the liquidity risk appetite. Yep. And we spend a lot of time with them just explaining what we're up to and showing them the investments that we're doing. It's unusual, but we actually have our board look at every material investment that we do. Okay. So a lot of boards will sit above that, and the investment committee or the internal executive will do that. We take those things to our board quite deliberately because we want to bring them on the journey of how we're building the portfolio. So they understand it, they get how we're different, they get what could go wrong, so that if something does go wrong for a period of time, it's not a surprise. Yep. And so that we think that's a really important part of successfully doing this model.
Excellent, thanks. Susie, a question for you. For the children that are restored to their families, do you keep track of their well-being afterwards on a sort of go-forward basis?
Not as part of the social impact bond. That was really about restoration rather than an ongoing piece, although NUPIN itself have looked at that and the tracking of whether those families stay together. Not all families stay together, but at a much higher rate than what was seen in the counterfactual, what was happening before.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Sam, another question for you. Does the future fund's long-term focus allow it to outperform superannuation funds that are subject to the short-term focus imposed by the performance test?
Yes. So I think in the long run, we should at least be able to deliver our mandate with a level of risk that gives us a higher risk-adjusted outcome. So I do think that should be achievable, and I think we have achieved that. We don't focus on what the super funds are doing. But we do want to learn from them, just like we want to learn from any of our peers. Yes. Super funds, in general, are holding higher levels of listed equities than we are, and they have a higher overall risk profile than we do, as I was trying to explain in the talk, whereas we're trying to derive a bit more of our return from value-add activities. Yes. And we think overall that gives us a mandate-achieving portfolio, but one that has a bit lower level of through-the-cycle risk. Yep. It means a higher quality return is what we're striving for. Yep. But we definitely learn from our peers. Yep. We spend quite a bit of time, meeting with local funds and global funds and comparing notes on how we do things. And there's a lot to be learnt from each other. Yep.
So in sort of simple terms, the risk to you is not finding alpha, whereas the risk to them is more in that sort of beta side of things.
I would say, but it's at the margin, right? We're still taking a lot of broad market risk. And look, if broad markets are really difficult and real returns are really hard to come by, it's going to be very difficult for us to achieve our mandate. But we're hoping to do that in a way where, in a really hard world, we're at least preserving real wealth. Yes. We may not meet our mandate, but we're at least preserving the real capital. Yeah,
excellent. Susie, for the social benefit bonds, could you talk a bit more about the cost savings to the government? Are they shared at sort of state and federal level, and to what extent the savings are realisable in the time horizons that you set? Are you getting the right duration for the social impact bonds?
Yeah, great great question. For anyone who's done anything with governments interacting between state and territory and Commonwealth, it will not be surprising to you. We haven't managed to get them to agree to a financial instrument where there are savings accrued to one and expenditure from the other. So all of the social impact bonds in Australia have been with a state government where the expenditure on, for example, emergency hospital beds or on people in out-of-home care or on people in prison is done by the state, and then the savings would then be for the state as well. Often there are savings that would accrue but in a different time horizon to the Commonwealth. So for example, young people who are attending school might save welfare payments to the Commonwealth and they might become taxpayers, but we haven't found a mechanism yet that anyone can agree on. In terms of the horizon, sorry, I didn't answer the savings question. So the savings are realisable when they are things like payments to families who are foster carers or to things that are quite discrete. Harder, as everyone knows, working in health, to see things like closing down a hospital ward, but there's still discrete expenditure that can be pointed to. In terms of the horizon, we absolutely have chosen things where you can see the savings within the horizon timeline. Usually the first sort of 2-3 years of a social impact bond, you're seeing neither here nor there, and that's the reason why they're mostly 7, 8, 9 years long. One of the challenges in that kind of instrument actually is the turnover in all of the bureaucrats. So every person in government changes jobs within 7, 8, 9 years, which is normal and healthy, but sometimes the purpose of creating the experiment is lost in the contracting, and so each new senior kind of government official needs to be almost inducted into why are we doing this and what are we trying to test.
Excellent. Sam, obviously head of dynamic asset allocation. So someone has asked a question about a dynamic strategy in a dynamic environment and how that seems reasonable, but they're also concerned that this places an increased burden on execution, knee-jerk reactions, sort of flip-flopping. So how in practice do you actually manage that, given markets are moving on a daily basis and assessment of risk?
Yeah, really important, and does come back to governance and frameworks, I would say. So we have very clear frameworks that we've developed over a number of years for how we are prepared to vary our portfolio. And my team has, in the medium, we call it the medium-term DAA part of the team, has built out a range of quantitative signals which look at both valuation and cyclical as well as technical type indicators. And we are very clear about how much risk we're prepared to take and when we're taking that risk. I think one of the advantages we have over like a hedge fund is we don't have clients who are going to pull all their money out of us if we have a bad quarter or a bad year. So it is an example of where the long horizon helps. So we can not have any positions on in our medium-term approach if there's nothing interesting to do. We can have very big positions if there's lots of interesting things to do. And we can hold those positions. And we have to have the buy-in from the stakeholder, principally the board and the investment committee, to do that. So that all comes back to clear frameworks and the governance in place that means that protects yourself. Like, you've got to protect yourself from yourself, which is making sure that, you know, a knee-jerk reaction or, you know, wanting to just break the rules is quite difficult, is protected. We do allow for qualitative factors as well, though. Those are important. We call them insights, things that models are missing and that prices aren't yet reflecting, we think are important to factor in.
Excellent. Now, we're coming up on time. Very quick final question for you, Susie. Is there scope for a much wider scale market competitive social impact market without government intervention? Can this be driven by the private sector?
No. No, I don't think so. I think most of the areas that we care deeply about, government is the largest regulator, funder and deliverer of social impact in this country and plays a crucial role in every domain: early childhood, health, education, employment, housing, general wellbeing. So government's in there, whether they're in there explicitly to drive social impact investing or just as the funder and the regulator of, say, aged care or education, they're still in there. So I think it is only going to be underpinned by governments. Private investors and philanthropy have a role at demonstrating what's possible under the current sort of setup, and then we use that to take it to governments to say, and if you do it slightly differently in this way, here's the kind of impact that you could drive.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid we've hit time. There are other questions that have come through. So for those of you who asked questions we didn't get to, please come up and talk to Sam and Susie. I'd like to thank both of them for their insights. I think we can all think bigger and live better. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Douglas.